London society is a machine fueled by cruelty and silk. The rules are simple. Punch down, kiss up, and never, ever make a scene. Beatrice knew the rules perfectly well. She simply didn't care to follow them. When she stepped between a vicious, social-climbing debutante and an eccentric old woman in a crowded modiste shop, she thought she was just saving a pensioner from a bad afternoon. She didn't know she had just auditioned for the most terrifying role in England, daughter-in-law to a duke. The air inside Madame Valerius's shop tasted of heavily perfumed dust and desperate ambition. It was the height of the London season, a time when the city's elite crammed themselves into poorly ventilated rooms to judge one another's financial worth based entirely on the width of a ribbon. Beatrice Hastings stood near the back of the shop, nursing a quiet, pulsing headache. At 26, she was firmly categorized by the Ton as a spinster. It was a title she wore like a comfortable, well-worn coat. It granted her a certain invisibility. No one looked at a 26-year-old woman with a modest dowry and sharp, observant eyes. They looked right through her, straight to the 19-year-old heiresses fluttering near the imported French silks. She ran a gloved thumb over a bolt of dark green velvet. It was beautiful, but heavy. Too heavy for a summer gown. She was only here because her younger sister Louisa was currently hidden behind a changing screen, agonizing over the drape of a muslin bodice. Beatrice preferred the quiet corners. From here, she could watch the ecosystem of the shop. Near the front window, the afternoon light caught the golden curls of Miss Harriet Finch. Harriet was 19, possessed a dowry that could buy a small island, and had a voice like a silver spoon scraping the bottom of a china teacup. Beside her stood her mother, Mrs. Finch, a woman whose entire posture suggested she was perpetually smelling something rotten. "I simply will not have it in blue, madam." Harriet's voice carried over the low hum of the shop, cutting through the rustle of fabric. "Blue is for country girls and second daughters. I require the gold. The Duke of Ashbourne is returning to town this week, and I am told he favors gold." Beatrice stifled a sigh. The Duke of Ashbourne, Leopold, a man famously reclusive, notoriously wealthy, and entirely sick of the London marriage mart. Every mother in Mayfair was currently treating his impending arrival like a military campaign. Beatrice tuned out Harriet's shrill demands and turned her attention to the small table of discarded remnants near the counter. It was a chaotic pile of offcuts, scraps of lace, ends of ribbon, slightly bruised silk flowers. Standing beside the table was a small, stooped figure. Beatrice paused, her brow furrowing. The woman did not belong in Madame Valerius's. She wore a heavy, charcoal-grey wool pelisse that was at least a decade out of fashion. The hem was frayed, meticulously darned, but unmistakably worn. Her bonnet was a structured, unadorned black thing that shadowed her face. The old woman had stripped off one of her gloves, the leather cracked and faded, to run a bare, wrinkled hand over a length of delicate, incredibly expensive Brussels lace. Her fingers moved with a slow, reverent gentleness. It was a quiet, private moment. Then, Harriet Finch turned around. Harriet had abandoned the debate over the gold silk and was now pacing the shop floor, looking for a mirror that flattered her profile. She stopped short when she saw the woman in grey. A look of profound, theatrical disgust washed over Harriet's face. She looked at the old woman, then at the lace in her hand, and then turned to the hovering shop assistant. "What?" Harriet demanded, her voice ringing out in the suddenly quiet shop. "Is that doing in here?" The assistant, a nervous girl with pins held in her mouth, turned pale. "Miss Finch, Does Madame Valerius now cater to the workhouse?" Harriet took a step closer to the old woman, pulling her expensive skirts tightly against her legs, as if proximity might transmit a disease. Or did someone leave the servants' entrance ajar? The old woman did not flinch. She slowly turned her head, fixing Harriet with a look from beneath the brim of her ugly black bonnet. "I am merely looking at the lace, young lady," the woman said. Her voice was raspy, dry like autumn leaves, but remarkably steady. "You are touching it," Harriet snapped, her face flushing with the indignation of a woman who has never once been told no. "With bare, filthy hands. You will ruin the weave. Look at you. You couldn't afford a single inch of that lace if you saved for a decade." Mrs. Finch, drawn by the sound of her daughter's elevated voice, hurried over, her eyes narrowing at the intruder. "Good heavens, Harriet, step away. The woman probably has fleas. Girl!" She snapped her fingers at the paralyzed assistant. "Remove this vagrant at once. We are spending a fortune in this establishment, and I will not have my daughter breathing the same air as a street beggar." The shop fell dead silent. A dozen aristocratic women watched. None of them moved. It was the cardinal rule of their class: never intervene in someone else's tantrum. It was terribly poor form. Beatrice felt the familiar hot prickle of anger at the base of her neck. She looked at the old woman. The woman stood perfectly still, her thin shoulders squared, still holding the edge of the Brussels lace. There was no fear in her posture, only a deep, profound weariness. Beatrice dropped the bolt of green velvet. Beatrice closed the distance across the shop floor in 4 long strides. She didn't hurry. Hurrying showed panic. She walked with the measured, heavy tread of someone completely comfortable in her own authority. "Miss Finch," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a specific, cold resonance that made Harriet jump. Harriet whipped around, her eyes wide. When she saw it was only Beatrice Hastings, the spinster with the mediocre dowry, her expression soured. "Miss Hastings, this does not concern you." "You are quite right," Beatrice said, stopping beside the old woman. She was taller than Harriet by several inches, a physical advantage she rarely used, but was currently very grateful for. "It does not concern me. However, your volume is giving me a migraine, and I am finding your lack of basic manners deeply offensive." A collective gasp echoed from the corners of the room. Mrs. Finch puffed up like an angry pigeon. "How dare you! My daughter is merely pointing out that a beggar has infiltrated a respectable establishment." "A beggar," Beatrice interrupted, her tone conversational. She turned to look at the old woman. Up close, the frayed edges of the woman's coat were visible. Yes. But Beatrice also noticed that the wool, though old, was impeccably clean. The woman's eyes, caught in the shadow of the bonnet, were a startling, piercing blue. They were bright, intelligent, and highly amused. Beatrice looked back at Harriet. "I see no beggar, Miss Finch. I see an elderly woman admiring a piece of lace. I also see a young woman behaving with all the grace and dignity of a cornered badger." Harriet's mouth fell open. You cannot speak to me like that. I am a Finch. My father—" "Your father earned his fortune in shipping, if I recall," Beatrice said smoothly. "A highly respectable trade, which makes it all the more baffling why you act as though you were born with a crown on your head rather than a ledger in your hand. Wealth, Miss Finch, can buy you a gold silk gown. It apparently cannot buy you a shred of common decency." "Get out!" Mrs. Finch shrieked at the shop assistant. "Throw them both out. I will take my business to Madame Celeste." "You are perfectly welcome to do so," Beatrice countered, stepping slightly in front of the old woman, shielding her from the Finch's venom. "Though I hear Madame Celeste requires her clients to possess a modicum of class, you might find the entrance requirement somewhat steep." Harriet looked like she might burst into tears of pure rage. She opened her mouth, closed it, and finally settled on a vicious glare. "You will regret this, Beatrice Hastings. You are a nobody, a dried-up spinster who will die alone. Do not think society will not hear of how you defend the gutter trash over your betters." "If you are my better, Miss Finch." Beatrice said softly, her eyes entirely dead. "Then I welcome the grave." Harriet spun on her heel, her skirt snapping like a whip. "Come, mother, I will not stay in this squalor a moment longer." They stormed toward the door, scattering assistants like frightened birds. The bell above the door violently chimed as they exited, slamming the heavy glass behind them. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. The other patrons of the shop immediately looked away, suddenly fascinated by gloves and ribbons, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a social execution. Beatrice let out a long, slow breath, feeling the adrenaline begin to crash. Her hands were shaking slightly. She hated making scenes. She hated the spotlight. "Well," a dry, raspy voice said from beside her, "that was remarkably vicious." Beatrice turned. The old woman had not moved. She was still holding the Brussels lace, looking up at Beatrice with those startling blue eyes. There was a faint, crooked smile on her thin lips. "I apologize," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a softer register. She offered a tired smile. "Fear I have a terrible temper when it comes to bullies. Are you all right, madam?" "I am quite well," the woman said. She looked down at the lace in her hand. "Though I fear I have caused a disruption, the young lady was correct in one regard. I cannot afford this lace." Beatrice looked at the delicate, spider-web pattern of the fabric. It was beautiful. "It is meant to be admired," Beatrice said gently. "Madame Valerius leaves the offcuts here for inspiration." "I used to make lace," the old woman murmured, her thumb rubbing the edge. "A long time ago. My hands." She held up her bare hand. The joints were swollen, the fingers slightly twisted with age and arthritis. "My hands do not obey me anymore. I merely wished to feel the quality." Beatrice's chest tightened. There was something about the woman, a quiet, unbroken dignity, that made Beatrice's heart ache. The cruelty of the world, especially the London world, was so casual. It ground people into dust without a second thought. "It is beautiful work," Beatrice said. She looked toward the counter. The nervous assistant was watching them with wide eyes. Beatrice reached into her reticule. She withdrew a small leather purse. She didn't have much pin money. Her father's estate was heavily entailed, and her brother was notoriously tight-fisted. But she had enough. "How much for this piece?" Beatrice called out to the assistant. The assistant blinked. "Oh, miss, that is an offcut. We usually sell it for 5 shillings. It was a lie. 5 shillings was practically giving it away for Brussels lace, but the assistant was clearly terrified of Beatrice after the dressing down she'd given Harriet. Beatrice walked to the counter, placed a shiny half-sovereign on the glass, and waved away the change. She picked up the lace, wrapped it carefully in a sheet of tissue paper, and walked back to the old woman. "Here," Beatrice said, holding out the small, rustling package. The old woman looked at the package, then up at Beatrice. Her white eyebrows drew together. "I cannot accept charity, child." "It isn't charity," Beatrice said firmly, though her eyes were kind. "It is an apology. On behalf of my entire, miserable generation. Please, take it. Use it to mend something, or simply keep it in a drawer to look at. But do not let that wretched girl's voice be the last thing you remember of this afternoon." The old woman studied Beatrice's face for a long, quiet moment. It was an unsettling gaze. It felt as though the woman were peeling back Beatrice's skin and examining the machinery underneath. Slowly, the gnarled hand reached out and took the package. "You are a very strange girl," the old woman said softly. Beatrice laughed, a short, genuine sound. "So my family constantly reminds me. Now you should probably slip out before Madame Valerius realizes what I paid for that lace and has me arrested for theft." The old woman chuckled. It was a dusty, wheezing sound, but it held genuine warmth. I will take my leave. Thank you, Miss Hastings. Beatrice Hastings. Miss Hastings. I suspect we shall meet again. The woman gave a slight, strangely elegant nod of her head, entirely at odds with her frayed wool coat. Beatrice watched her turn and walk slowly toward the door. She moved with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a plain wooden cane Beatrice hadn't noticed before. "Bea!" Louisa's voice hissed from the changing screen. Beatrice sighed, turning away from the door. Her sister emerged, looking stunning in the muslin, completely oblivious to the war that had just been fought in the shop. "Did I hear shouting?" Louisa asked, adjusting a sleeve. "Just Harriet Finch realizing the world doesn't revolve around her." Beatrice replied dryly. "It was a painful epiphany. Turn around, let me see the back." 20 minutes later, the muslin dress was ordered, the bill was sent to their brother's solicitor, and Beatrice was ready to go home and lie in a dark room with a cool cloth over her eyes. The bell chimed as the Hastings sisters exited Madame Valerius's. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows across the pavement of Bond Street. Carriages clattered over the cobblestones, the noise of the city a stark contrast to the stifling quiet of the shop. Beatrice stood on the pavement, pulling on her gloves, when she noticed a commotion down the street. Traffic had stopped. A massive, lacquered black carriage, pulled by 4 magnificent, perfectly matched midnight black geldings, was blocking the intersection. It was a vehicle designed to intimidate. No crest was visible on the door, but it didn't need one. Everything about it screamed immense, unfathomable wealth. People on the street were pausing, staring, whispering behind gloved hands. Beatrice frowned, squinting against the sun. Standing on the curb, right near the intimidating carriage, was the old woman in the grey coat. She looked small and vulnerable against the massive, gleaming wheels. Beatrice's protective instinct flared again. Is she lost? Is the driver harassing her for standing in the way? "Wait here," Beatrice told Louisa, who was busy fixing her bonnet in a shop window's reflection. Beatrice hurried down the pavement, dodging pedestrians. As she got closer, the door to the black carriage swung open. The man who stepped down did not belong in the middle of a bustling London street. He belonged in a Gothic novel or leading a cavalry charge. He was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders tailored flawlessly into a dark, superfine coat. His hair was black, swept back from a harsh, aristocratic face with high cheekbones and a jaw that looked carved from granite. He was terrifyingly handsome, but his expression was one of cold, murderous fury. He glared at the footman holding the door. "I told you to wait at the corner!" His voice carried over the street noise. It was a deep, resonant baritone that sent a strange shiver down Beatrice's spine. "Apologies, Your Grace," the footman stammered, bowing so low he nearly scraped the pavement. "But the traffic, Your Grace." Beatrice froze in her tracks, about 10 paces away. A duke. She watched, her breath catching, as the terrifying giant of a man turned his dark, furious gaze away from the footman. He looked toward the curb. He looked at the old woman in the frayed grey wool coat. Beatrice braced herself. If he shouted at the old woman, duke or not, she was going to hit him with her parasol. But the duke did not shout. The cold fury evaporated from his face, replaced instantly by a look of profound, exasperated affection. He stepped forward, closing the distance to the old woman, and gently, with massive, gloved hands, took her by the elbows. "Mother." Leopold, the Duke of Ashbourne, sighed, his deep voice softening into something incredibly tender. "What did we discuss about you wandering off without a footman? And why are you wearing that hideous coat? It smells like mothballs and despair." The old woman, the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, smacked her son lightly on the arm with her wooden cane. "Oh, hush, Leo. It keeps the sycophants away. If I dress in my silks, I can't take 2 steps without some mother shoving her simpering daughter in my path. You are going to give my steward a heart attack. He thought you'd been kidnapped." The Duke looked down at her hands and noticed the small tissue paper package. "What is that?" Agatha, the Dowager Duchess, looked down at the package containing the Brussels lace. A slow, knowing smile spread across her wrinkled face. "A gift," Agatha said softly, her sharp blue eyes flicking up from the package and scanning the crowd. "From a most remarkable young woman." Beatrice stood frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mother, Your Grace, Leo." Beatrice realized she was staring. She realized her mouth was slightly open. She realized she had just berated the daughter of a shipping magnate to defend the mother of the most powerful, ruthless duke in England. She had given charity to a woman who owned half of Derbyshire. Agatha's scanning gaze locked onto Beatrice. The old woman's smile widened. She raised her gnarled hand, still holding the small package, and offered Beatrice a tiny, deliberate wave. The Duke, following his mother's line of sight, turned his head. Beatrice found herself pinned under a stare so intense it felt physical. His eyes were dark, a stormy, impossible grey. He looked at her, standing there in her plain afternoon dress, her parasol clutched in a white-knuckled grip. He didn't look at her the way the rest of the ton did. He didn't look through her. He looked at her, intently, taking in her flushed cheeks, her wide eyes, her rigid posture. For a second, the bustling street fell entirely silent. The world narrowed down to the space between them. Then panic set in. Beatrice spun on her heel, grabbed her skirts, and practically sprinted back toward Madame Valerius's. "Bee!" Louisa yelped as Beatrice grabbed her arm and dragged her down the street. "What on earth are you doing? You're wrinkling my sleeve." "Walking," Beatrice gasped, her face burning. "We are walking very fast, Louisa. We are never returning to Bond Street. I am joining a convent in France." Back by the carriage, Leopold watched the woman flee. He turned back to his mother, one dark eyebrow raised in a silent question. "Her name," Agatha said smoothly, letting her son hand her up into the plush, velvet interior of the carriage, "is Miss Beatrice Hastings. And Leo, darling?" Leopold stepped in after her, pulling the door shut. "Yes, mother?" Agatha unwrapped the tissue paper, smoothing the Brussels lace over her lap. "Cancel our return to the country. I believe we are staying for the remainder of the season." The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a footman wearing livery that cost more than Beatrice's annual wardrobe allowance. It lay on the silver salver in the Hastings' cramped morning room like an unexploded bomb, thick cream-colored vellum, a heavy wax seal bearing the crest of a roaring lion. Beatrice's older brother, Richard, stared at it. He had paused mid-bite of his toast, a crumb clinging to his lower lip. Richard was a man who calculated the monetary value of every interaction he had before speaking. Currently, his brain was short-circuiting. "The Duke of Ashbourne," Richard said. He spoke the name as if uttering a prayer in a crumbling church. "He is hosting a ball, on Friday." Louisa snatched the heavy card from the salver, her eyes scanning the elegant script. "It's addressed to the family, Richard. All of us. Even Bee." Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. It was lukewarm and slightly bitter. She swallowed it without grimacing. "I assure you I have no desire to attend. You and Louisa can go and represent the Hastings interests perfectly well." "Don't be absurd," Richard snapped, suddenly animated. He tossed his napkin onto the table. "You will go. Do you have any idea what this means? Ashbourne hasn't opened his London house in 5 years. The man practically lives in a cave in Derbyshire. If he is hosting, it means he is looking. And if he is looking, every family with a daughter under 30 is going to be there, trying to claw their way to the altar. Which is precisely why I shouldn't go." Beatrice pointed out gently. "I am 26, Richard. I am not clawing anywhere. I would rather stay home and read the new parliamentary reports. At least the politicians are honest about their lying." "You are going," Richard said, his tone final. "We need the social capital. Being seen at Ashbourne House elevates us. Besides, Louisa needs a chaperone while I am networking." Beatrice looked out the window. The sky was the color of dirty slate. She knew exactly why that invitation had arrived. It had nothing to do with Richard's non-existent political influence or Louisa's pretty face. It had everything to do with a piece of Brussels lace and a frail woman in a frayed coat. "I suspect we shall meet again." The Dowager Duchess's words echoed in Beatrice's mind, sharp and dry as a winter branch. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. By Thursday, the entire ton was vibrating with a hysterical, frantic energy. Modistes were working their seamstresses to the bone. Florists were ransacked. The rumour mill was churning out wild theories. The most prominent theory, loudly broadcasted by Mrs. Finch at a Tuesday music hall, was that the Duke had seen Harriet through the window of Madame Valerius's shop on his way through town, had been instantly captivated by her golden profile, and decided to throw a ball solely to secure an introduction. Beatrice had listened to this theory from a corner of the room, her face perfectly blank. "She is insufferable," Louisa had whispered, watching Harriet preen by the pianoforte. "She is terrified," Beatrice corrected quietly. "Loud people usually are. If she stops talking about how inevitable her triumph is, she might have to consider the possibility of failure." Now, standing before her narrow bedroom mirror on Friday evening, Beatrice prepared for the slaughter. She had refused to buy a new dress. Instead, she wore her darkest, least obtrusive gown, a deep plum silk that swallowed the light. She wore no jewelry, save for a simple string of seed pearls that had belonged to her mother. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, anchored with heavy pins. She looked exactly like what she intended to be, part of the furniture. "You look like you are going to a very fashionable funeral," Louisa observed, leaning in the doorway. Louisa, by contrast, looked like a spun sugar confection in pale pink. "I am," Beatrice said, turning away from the glass. I'm going to the funeral of my quiet, uninterrupted life. Let us get this over with." Ashbourne House did not merely occupy space on the square, it dominated it. It was a massive, imposing structure of Portland stone, its dozens of windows blazing with the light of thousands of wax candles. The line of carriages waiting to deposit their aristocratic cargo stretched around the corner. The air inside the ballroom was suffocating. It smelled of crushed orchids, hot wax, and the metallic tang of sweat hidden beneath expensive French perfume. A string orchestra played a lively waltz in the gallery above, but the music was nearly drowned out by the roar of 300 people trying to sound more important than they were. Beatrice immediately initiated her survival protocol. She steered Louisa toward a cluster of potted palms near the terrace doors. It offered a clear view of the room, while providing a physical barrier against the crowd. Richard vanished within 3 minutes, drawn to a group of elderly lords like a moth to a flame. "It is magnificent," Louisa breathed, her eyes wide as she took in the gilded ceiling and the massive crystal chandeliers. "It is loud," Beatrice said. She scanned the room. The social hierarchy was visibly mapped out on the floor. The minor gentry hovered near the walls. The wealthy merchants trying to buy their way into the peerage clustered near the food. And in the centre, near the grand staircase, stood the apex predators. Harriet Finch was there. She wore the gold silk. It was, admittedly, a stunning dress, cut dangerously low and draped perfectly. She stood surrounded by her mother and a gaggle of sycophants holding court, her eyes darting constantly towards the empty landing of the staircase. She was waiting for her duke. Beatrice took a step back, letting the shadow of a large fern obscure her face. She just needed to survive 3 hours. 3 hours, and she could go home, take off her shoes, and forget any of this had happened. A sudden collective hush fell over the room. It didn't happen all at once. It rolled from the grand staircase outward, a wave of silence killing the conversation. At the top of the stairs stood Leopold, Duke of Ashbourne. He was wearing stark, severe evening dress. Black coat, white cravat, no medals, no ribbons. He didn't need them. His sheer physical presence commanded the room. He looked down at the sea of expectant faces with an expression of profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He didn't look like a man searching for a bride. He looked like a man evaluating a room full of cattle. Beside him stood the Dowager Duchess. Beatrice's breath hitched. Agatha was transformed. Gone was the frayed grey wool and the ugly black bonnet. She wore a gown of heavy midnight blue velvet that swallowed the light. At her throat rested a sapphire the size of a quail's egg, surrounded by diamonds that threw prisms of light across the walls. She leaned on her wooden cane, but her posture was iron straight. She looked like a queen surveying a slightly disappointing kingdom. The Duke and his mother began their descent. The crowd parted for them, practically pressing themselves into the walls to create a wide path. Harriet Finch stepped forward, right to the edge of the human corridor. Posing perfectly, a bright, practiced smile plastered across her face. Mrs. Finch was practically vibrating with anticipation behind her. Leopold reached the floor. He began to walk. He didn't look at the women throwing themselves into his line of sight. He didn't acknowledge the deep bows of the men. His dark, stormy eyes were scanning the perimeter of the room, moving past the gilded mirrors, past the ice sculptures, past Harriet Finch. Harriet's smile faltered as the Duke walked right by her without breaking his stride. He didn't even blink in her direction. He was walking toward the potted palms. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. She instinctively took another step back, her heel hitting the plaster wall. "Don't look at me. Walk past. Please, God, keep walking." But he didn't. The crowd parted ahead of him, leaving a clear, painfully empty stretch of floor between the Duke of Ashbourne and Beatrice Hastings. He stopped a few feet away. Up close, the harsh angles of his face were even more pronounced. The faint shadow of a beard along his jaw suggested he hated his valet as much as he hated this party. He looked down at her. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 300 pairs of eyes were pinned on the spinster in the plum dress. "Miss Hastings?" Leopold said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that carried perfectly in the quiet room. Beatrice sank into a flawless, mechanical curtsy. Her mind was racing, trying to find a way to deflect this, to disappear. "Your Grace," she said, keeping her eyes fixed on the silver buckles of his shoes. "Look at me." It wasn't a request, it was a command, spoken softly but with absolute authority. Beatrice straightened. She met his gaze. His eyes were not cold, she realized. They were just aggressively observant. He was dissecting her, just as his mother had done outside the modiste's shop. "My mother informed me that I owed a debt to a woman in a modiste shop," Leopold said slowly, loud enough for the closest bystanders to hear. "She told me this woman defended a stranger against a remarkably vicious attack by a young girl with more money than sense." A sharp, collective intake of breath echoed from the center of the room. Harriet Finch let out a strangled squeak. Leopold didn't break eye contact with Beatrice. "I assumed my mother was exaggerating. She enjoys drama. But I see she was understating the matter. I merely spoke out of turn, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice tight but steady. "I have a habit of doing so. It is a flaw I am constantly reminded of." "Is it?" The corner of his mouth twitched, a millimeter of a smile. "I find it remarkably efficient. You cut straight through the rotting wood to get to the core, a rare trait in this city. He held out his hand. It was a large hand, encased in white silk. "They are playing a waltz, Miss Hastings," he said. "And my mother has threatened to beat me with her cane if I do not dance with you." Beatrice stared at his hand. This was a public execution. If she took his hand, she would be placing a target on her back for the rest of her life. The ton would tear her apart. Harriet Finch would likely hire an assassin. She looked at his face. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was forcing her out of the shadows. But there was no malice in his eyes, only a quiet, demanding challenge. "Are you brave enough?" Beatrice let out a slow, steadying breath. She placed her gloved hand in his. "I would hate for your grace to suffer a bruising on my account," she said flatly. Leopold's fingers closed around hers. His grip was firm, warm, and entirely grounding. "You are very kind. Come, let us go ruin your reputation." He did not lead her to the center of the floor immediately. He walked at a measured pace, forcing the crowd to fall back, giving them space. The orchestra, which had faltered during the Duke's approach, frantically picked up the tempo of the waltz. When they finally took their positions, Leopold pulled her slightly closer than was strictly proper. It wasn't an intimate gesture, it was a barricade. It insulated them from the hundreds of glaring eyes pressing in on them. "You are stiff, Miss Hastings," Leopold noted as he swept her into the first turn. His movements were precise, powerful, and utterly effortless. He didn't dance. He navigated the floor like a captain steering a warship through a narrow channel. "I am terrified, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, honestly, keeping her voice low. "There are women in this room currently calculating how to poison my tea. I can feel them staring at the back of my neck." Leopold let out a short, rough laugh. It sounded rusty, as if he didn't use it often. "Let them stare. They are vultures. They only pick at things that are already dead or dying. You, Miss Hastings, are very much alive. I was perfectly content being dead to society," she countered, matching his steps. "Invisibility is a highly underrated survival tactic." "Invisibility is a coward's tactic," he corrected smoothly. "And you are not a coward. A coward does not humiliate a shipping heiress in public to protect an old woman." Beatrice glanced away, looking over his broad shoulder. "I didn't know she was a duchess. If I had known—" "If you had known what?" he prompted, turning them smoothly past a cluster of shocked dowagers. "Would you have walked away? Let Miss Finch continue her tirade?" "No," Beatrice admitted, her jaw tightening. "But I wouldn't have given her a half-sovereign out of pity either. That was incredibly patronizing of me." "My mother," Leopold said, his tone shifting into something warm and distinctly proud, "has an estate that generates £40,000 a year. She owns a collection of rubies that Catherine the Great once tried to buy, and yet that piece of lace you bought her is currently sitting on her vanity table next to her hairbrushes. She hasn't stopped talking about it for 3 days." Beatrice looked back up at him. "Why was she wearing that dreadful coat?" "Because she finds London ridiculous," he answered simply. "She dresses down to see who will treat her with basic human dignity when she strips away the title and the wealth. It is a cynical game. She usually goes an entire season without finding a single person who passes the test." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers again. "Until Tuesday." They moved across the floor in silence for a moment. The physical reality of the man was overwhelming. He didn't smell of cheap cologne like the other men. He smelled of clean linen, saddle leather, and the crisp, cold air of the north. "You do not like the ton either," Beatrice observed, stating a fact rather than asking a question. "I loathe it," Leopold replied without hesitation. It is a marketplace where human beings are weighed, priced, and traded for land and influence. It is degrading to everyone involved. Yet here you are, Beatrice pointed out, a touch of her natural cynicism bleeding through, hosting the biggest market of the year. I am here because my mother required a stage, Leopold said. She wanted to make a point, and the Ashbournes do not make points quietly. A point. Yes. He spun her, the plum silk of her skirt flaring out against his black trousers. She wanted to demonstrate to London what actual grace looks like. She wanted to humiliate the Finch family for their vulgarity. And mostly she wanted to see what you would do when dragged into the light. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. I am not a performing monkey, Your Grace, nor am I a pawn in your mother's social games. I know. Leopold's grip on her waist tightened fractionally. If I thought you were, I wouldn't have asked you to dance. I would have sent you a lovely bouquet of flowers with a polite thank you note and left you to your precious invisibility. The music swelled, signaling the final bars of the waltz. Leopold slowed their movements, bringing them to a stop near the edge of the floor. He didn't step back immediately. He kept her close for 1 second longer than necessary. You are angry, he noted, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. I am annoyed, Beatrice corrected, stepping back and dropping into a quick, sharp curtsy. I do not like being manipulated, even by duchesses. Good, Leopold said. There was a dangerous, fascinating gleam in his eye now. Keep that anger, Miss Hastings. You are going to need it. Before Beatrice could ask what he meant, the Duke offered a stiff, formal bow, turned on his heel, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd toward the card rooms. Beatrice stood alone on the edge of the dance floor. She felt exposed, stripped of her armor. She turned to find Louisa and Richard. Before she could take a step, a shadow fell across her path. It was the Dowager Duchess. She had materialized from the crowd, leaning heavily on her cane, the sapphire at her throat glittering violently in the candlelight. She looked at Beatrice, her sharp blue eyes crinkling at the corners. Well done, my dear, Agatha rasped. You didn't step on his toes once. Your Grace, Beatrice said, her tone guarded. Your son informs me I am part of a demonstration. Agatha chuckled, a dusty, dry sound. My son lacks tact. He thinks everything is a cavalry charge. I apologize if we have overwhelmed you, Beatrice. May I call you Beatrice? You may call me whatever you wish, Your Grace. It appears you dictate reality in this room. A sharp tongue. Excellent. Agatha tapped her cane on the floor. Walk with me, child. Let us go to the supper room. I find standing in one place makes me a target for tedious conversations, and I wish to speak with you without Mrs. Finch attempting to throw her daughter under my feet. Beatrice didn't have a choice. She offered her arm, and the Duchess took it, her gnarled hand surprisingly strong. As they walked, the crowd parted for them, a red sea of silk and broadcloth. Beatrice kept her chin high, refusing to look at the staring faces. She had spent 6 years trying to fade into the background. In the span of a 10-minute dance, Leopold and Agatha had dragged her onto the center stage, handed her a script she hadn't read, and locked the doors behind her. The game had changed entirely, and Beatrice suddenly realized she had no idea what the rules were anymore. The supper room at Ashbourne House was a masterpiece of intimidation masquerading as hospitality. Long tables groaned under the weight of silver epergnes, roasted meats, and out-of-season fruits shipped in at exorbitant costs. Yet, for all the culinary extravagance, the atmosphere was as tense as a courtroom before a verdict. Agatha did not steer Beatrice towards the main tables. She navigated them toward a small, secluded alcove draped in heavy gold velvet, guarded by 2 footmen who looked more like hired muscle than domestic servants. Sit, Agatha commanded, lowering herself into a plush armchair with a weary sigh. She propped her wooden cane against the table. My knees are staging a violent rebellion. Beatrice took the opposite chair. She arranged her dark plum skirts, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes attempting to pierce the velvet drapery of their alcove. A footman immediately materialized, pouring a clear, fragrant broth into 2 porcelain bowls. I detest ballroom food, Agatha said, picking up her spoon. It is entirely designed for display rather than digestion. Eat the broth, Beatrice. It will settle your stomach. Beatrice picked up her spoon. The broth was hot, tasting richly of chicken and thyme. It grounded her, pulling her back from the surreal ledge she had been teetering on since Leopold took her hand. You are very quiet, Agatha observed. I am currently trying to determine if I am a guest or a hostage, Your Grace. Beatrice replied, taking another spoonful. Agatha barked a laugh. A fair question. You are a guest, I assure you, but I understand why you feel cornered. Leo is lacking in subtlety. He told me I was part of a demonstration. He is an idiot. Agatha rolled her eyes, a remarkably unducal gesture. Men always assume they understand the mechanics of society because they hold the titles. They do not. Society is run by women, Beatrice. It is a war fought in drawing rooms with invitations and intentional slights. Leo thinks he can simply march in, demand honesty, and march out. He does not understand the fallout. The fallout is that my family will be hounded by sycophants by tomorrow morning, and every woman of consequence in London will actively plot my demise. Beatrice stated plainly. Yes. Agatha agreed, her blue eyes sharp. Are you frightened? Beatrice considered the question. She thought of Richard's inevitable, suffocating ambition. She thought of Harriet Finch's venom. She looked at the old woman sitting across from her, a woman who wore her immense power with complete, unapologetic exhaustion. No, Beatrice said softly. I am not frightened. I am merely tired. I spent 6 years building a very quiet life. I liked my quiet life. Agatha's expression softened. The cynical, sharp edges of the Dowager Duchess melted away, leaving an elderly woman who looked deeply, profoundly lonely. My husband, the previous Duke, loved the noise, Agatha murmured, tracing the rim of her porcelain bowl. He loved the sycophants. He loved the endless, meaningless chatter. When he died, Leo inherited the title, the debt, and the vultures. He was 22. He spent 10 years fixing the estate, cleaning up his father's messes, and learning to hate the people who praised him to his face while waiting for him to fail. Beatrice remained silent, absorbing the weight of the confession. He needs a wife. Agatha continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Not a girl who faints when he raises his voice, not a woman who calculates her affection based on the balance of his ledgers. He needs someone who is not afraid of the dark, Beatrice. Someone who will stand in a crowded shop and tell a bully to go to hell. Before Beatrice could process the enormity of what Agatha was implying, the velvet curtains of the alcove were pulled back. Mrs. Finch stood there, gripping Harriet by the arm. Harriet looked pale, her lower lip trembling slightly. The gold silk of her dress suddenly looked heavy and ridiculous. Your Grace, Mrs. Finch said, executing a curtsy so deep she nearly toppled over. I do apologize for the intrusion. We simply had to pay our respects. Agatha did not look up from her broth. You are interrupting my supper, Mrs. Finch. I am so terribly sorry, Mrs. Finch babbled, her face flushing a dull, panicked red. She shoved Harriet slightly forward. Harriet wished to apologize. For Tuesday, we did not realize who you were, Your Grace. Ah, Agatha said dryly, finally resting her spoon in her bowl. She leaned back, leveling a gaze of pure ice at the two women. You did not realize I was a duchess, and that, of course, changes the mathematics of your cruelty, does it not? If I were truly a penniless old woman, your daughter's behavior would have been perfectly acceptable. Harriet flinched as if struck. Your Grace, Do not speak to me, Agatha snapped. The sheer authority in her voice made the air in the alcove turn freezing cold. You are a vulgar, cruel little girl. You judge the world entirely by its wrapping because you have absolutely nothing of substance inside your own. I have no interest in your apologies. They are motivated by terror, not regret. Mrs. Finch looked as though she might burst into tears. Your Grace, please. My husband standing— Your husband standing is not my concern, Agatha interrupted. She gestured toward Beatrice, who sat perfectly still. If you wish to apologize, you will apologize to Miss Hastings. She was the one forced to endure your screeching. Mrs. Finch and Harriet both stared at Beatrice. The idea of apologizing to a spinster with a mediocre dowry was visibly agonizing to them. It upended their entire world-view. Beatrice looked at Harriet. She saw the panic, the humiliation, the sheer desperation to cling to a rung on the social ladder. 6 years ago, Beatrice might have felt a spark of vindictive joy. Now she only felt pity. It was a miserable way to live. That will not be necessary, Beatrice said gently, breaking the heavy silence. Agatha frowned. Beatrice, do not let them off the hook. There is no hook, Your Grace, Beatrice replied, keeping her eyes on Harriet. An apology extorted under threat of social ruin is completely worthless. I do not want it. Miss Finch and I understand each other perfectly well. Let us leave it at that. Harriet's mouth parted slightly. She stared at Beatrice, confusion warring with relief on her face. For the first time, the golden girl looked entirely lost. You may go, Beatrice said quietly. Mrs. Finch grabbed her daughter's arm, dropping another hasty, awkward curtsy, and practically dragged Harriet out of the alcove, letting the velvet curtains fall shut behind them. Agatha sighed, picking up her spoon again. You are too merciful. Mercy requires power, Your Grace, Beatrice pointed out, her voice flat. I have none. I merely refused to participate in their degradation. It is exhausting. It is, a deep voice agreed from the shadows just outside the alcove. The heavy curtain was pushed aside, and Leopold stepped in. He looked at his mother, then at Beatrice. The stormy grey of his eyes was entirely focused on her. He had watched the entire exchange. The carriage is ready, Mother, Leopold said, though he didn't look away from Beatrice. The orchestra is playing the final set. The guests will be departing soon. Agatha smiled, a slow, immensely satisfied expression. She reached for her cane. Excellent. I have had enough of this circus. Miss Hastings, it was a profound pleasure sharing supper with you. Beatrice stood, dropping a polite curtsy. Your Grace. Leopold stepped aside to let his mother pass. Agatha walked slowly through the curtains, leaning on her cane, leaving the two of them alone in the dim light of the alcove. Leopold looked down at Beatrice. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was heavy, weighted with unsaid things. You did not gloat, Leopold noted, stepping slightly closer. Gloating is for people who are surprised by their own victories, Beatrice said, looking up at him. I did not win anything tonight, Your Grace. I merely survived it. Leopold reached out. For a second, Beatrice thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his large, warm hand lightly brushed the fabric of her plum sleeve. I will call on you on Monday, Miss Hastings, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of absolute intent. My brother will be thoroughly unbearable, Beatrice warned him, her heart executing a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. I do not care about your brother, Leopold replied quietly. He stepped back, the harsh angles of his face catching the dim candlelight. Good night, Beatrice." He did not wait for a reply. He turned and walked out, leaving Beatrice standing in the alcove, surrounded by cold supper and the terrifying realization that her quiet life was officially over. Saturday morning tasted of damp wool, cold tea, and raw panic. The Hastings household was in a state of chaotic upheaval. Richard had returned from Ashbourne House at 3 a.m, smelling of expensive brandy and vibrating with a manic, terrifying energy. By 8 o'clock, he had summoned the tailor, the modiste, and his solicitor. Beatrice sat at the breakfast table, staring at a piece of dry toast. "He danced with you." Richard was pacing the length of the dining room, his hands clasped behind his back. "He deliberately bypassed 3 earls' daughters, the Finch heiress, and Lady Mary to dance with you. And then the Dowager took you to supper. The Dowager Duchess. The woman is a dragon, Beatrice, and she shared her soup with you." "It was broth, Richard," Beatrice corrected tiredly. "It does not matter if it was poisoned water. It was a public endorsement." Richard stopped pacing and leaned over the table, his eyes wide, feverish. "Do you understand the leverage this gives us? If he calls, when he calls, you must be perfectly agreeable. You must agree with his opinions, laugh at his jokes." "I will not," Beatrice said. Richard blinked. "What do you mean, you will not?" "I mean, I will not simper. I will not laugh at jokes that are not funny. I will not pretend to be a porcelain doll." Beatrice pushed her plate away and stood up. "If the Duke of Ashbourne wanted a sycophant, he had a ballroom full of them to choose from. If he calls on me, he will get me. Nothing more, nothing less. You are throwing away the greatest opportunity this family has had in a century," Richard shouted, his face turning purple. "You will ruin this with your stubborn spinsterish pride." "My pride, Richard, is the only thing I actually own," Beatrice shot back, her voice deadly calm. She did not raise her volume, but the absolute finality in her tone made her brother snap his mouth shut. "You control the estate, you control my dowry, you control where I live, but you do not control my character." She turned and walked out of the dining room, ignoring Louisa's anxious, wide-eyed stare from the doorway. Beatrice needed air. She needed quiet. 10 minutes later, dressed in a plain brown walking habit and a sturdy bonnet, she slipped out the back door of the townhouse. She walked quickly, avoiding the main thoroughfares where carriages were already beginning their morning rounds of leaving calling cards. She headed toward a small, relatively obscure park a few streets over. It was not fashionable. There were no manicured gravel paths or ornamental lakes, just ancient, gnarled oak trees and patches of wild, untamed grass. The morning air was biting, carrying the sharp scent of an impending rainstorm. Beatrice breathed it in deeply, feeling the cold air clear the suffocating fog of her brother's ambition from her lungs. She walked for 20 minutes, letting her mind go blank. She refused to think about Leopold's dark eyes. She refused to think about the absolute certainty in his voice when he said her name. "You walk exactly like you dance." Beatrice froze. She turned around. Stepping out from the shadow of a massive oak tree was Leopold. He was not wearing the severe evening clothes of the night before. He wore a heavy riding coat of dark blue wool, tall boots splashed with mud, and a loosely tied cravat. He looked rougher, more dangerous, and entirely out of place in the small London park. "Do you make a habit of stalking women in public parks, Your Grace?" Beatrice asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden violent racing of her heart. "Only when they flee their own homes at 9 a.m, Leopold replied, closing the distance between them. He stopped a respectful few feet away. "Your footman was easily bribed. He mentioned you favored this square when you wished to avoid your brother." Beatrice scowled. "Remind me to dismiss him." "Don't. He was merely looking out for his livelihood. He knows I could buy this entire street if I wished." Leopold shoved his bare hands deep into the pockets of his coat. He looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were prominent in the harsh daylight. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" Beatrice asked softly. "You said you would call on Monday. This is Saturday morning. The Tun is likely still asleep, dreaming of ways to secure your fortune." "I am here," Leopold said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "because I realized I made a tactical error last night." Beatrice's chest tightened. Here it comes, the retreat, the realization that he went too far, that a spinster is not worth the scandal. She braced herself for the dismissal. "A tactical error?" "Yes." Leopold pulled his hands from his pockets. In his right hand he held a small, familiar tissue paper package. He held it out to her. Beatrice looked down. It was the Brussels lace. "My mother asked me to return this to you," Leopold said. Beatrice stared at it, a cold, hollow feeling spreading in her stomach. She had been right. It was over before it began. She reached out and took the package, her gloved fingers brushing his. "I see," she said quietly, looking away from him, staring at a patch of muddy grass. "The demonstration is concluded. The point has been made. I am to take my charity back and resume my invisibility." "Look at me, Beatrice," Leopold commanded. She snapped her head up, her eyes flashing with sudden defensive anger. "Do not speak to me like one of your servants, Your Grace. You have had your amusement. I am returning the lace." Leopold interrupted, his voice rising, drowning out her anger with a sheer, desperate intensity. "Because my mother told me that if I want you, I have to earn you myself. I cannot use her gratitude as a bridge." Beatrice stopped breathing. She stared at him, the small package crushed in her grip. Leopold took a step closer. The air between them crackled. "I spent 10 years fixing a broken estate, Beatrice. I spent 10 years surrounded by people who view me as a bank vault with a title attached. I am tired of the artifice. I am tired of the lies." He looked down at her, his stormy eyes stripping away every defense she had carefully constructed over the years. "I saw you in that shop," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I saw a woman who possessed more courage, more raw, unvarnished decency in her little finger than the entire peerage combined. You stood between a predator and prey, and you did not flinch. I do not want a porcelain doll. I do not want a political alliance. I want a partner." Beatrice swallowed hard. The cynical armor she wore was cracking, fracturing under the weight of his absolute, terrifying honesty. "I am not a romantic, Your Grace," she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. "I am practical. I am sharp-tongued. I will likely irritate you on a daily basis." "I am counting on it," Leopold replied, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. "A quiet house would drive me mad. My brother will try to exploit you. I will crush him financially if he tries. It will take me roughly 3 minutes." Beatrice let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She looked down at the lace in her hand, then back up at the towering, formidable man standing in the mud. "You are offering a very strange bargain, Leopold," she said, using his Christian name for the first time. Leopold's eyes darkened at the sound of his name on her lips. "I am offering you the truth, Beatrice. No games, no societal mechanics, just a life where you never have to hide in the corners again. Unless you want to, in which case we shall hide together." He did not ask for an answer then. He merely reached out, gently took her hand, pressed a firm, warm kiss to the back of her glove, and stepped away. "I will call on Monday," he said softly, "to ask your brother for permission. Be prepared to catch him when he faints." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the morning mist, leaving Beatrice alone under the oak tree. She looked down at the Brussels lace, the physical proof of a solitary act of kindness that had accidentally altered the trajectory of her entire life. She carefully folded the tissue paper, placed it in her pocket, and began the walk home. For the first time in 6 years, Beatrice Hastings did not look down at the pavement. She looked straight ahead. Monday afternoon arrived like an executioner. Richard paced the Persian rug, his boots carving a frantic trench into the wool. He smelled desperately of bay rum and raw anxiety. Louisa sat frozen on the sofa. Beatrice remained by the window in a plain green day dress, methodically turning the pages of a book she wasn't reading. When the brass knocker finally cracked against the heavy front door, Richard stopped breathing. Leopold walked in, stripping off his leather gloves. He bypassed the customary pleasantries entirely, his sheer physical presence suffocating the room's oxygen. Richard launched into a frantic, groveling bow. "Your Grace, a profound honor. Shall we repair to my study to discuss settlements?" "No," Leopold said. The word dropped like a lead weight. Richard blinked, his greedy smile faltering. "I beg your pardon? The dowry—" "I don't want your sister's dowry," Leopold interrupted, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I want your signature. You will sign a document waiving any future financial claims upon my estate. I am marrying Beatrice. I am not funding your political ambitions or paying your tailors. If you attempt to leverage my name for social or financial gain, I will bankrupt you by Thursday. Do we understand each other?" Richard's mouth opened and closed. The grand fantasy of tapping into the Ashbourne wealth evaporated in seconds, leaving only terror. I understand." "Good." Leopold dismissed him without another glance. He walked across the room to the window, stopping inches from Beatrice. The intimidating, ruthless Duke vanished. In his place stood the tired, brutally honest man from the park. He reached into his coat and produced a worn velvet box. He handed it to her closed. "It belonged to my grandmother," Leopold murmured, his attention entirely on Beatrice. "The tone is entirely too loud. But she loved my grandfather fiercely, and she never let a single person dictate her life. I thought it appropriate." Beatrice held the small, heavy box. She looked up into his stormy grey eyes, tracing the deep lines of exhaustion she knew she could help carry. He wasn't a fairy tale prince. He was a man holding a fortress, offering her a place on the wall. "I require my own library," Beatrice said quietly, holding his gaze. "I will not be confined to a drawing room, and I will not tolerate being managed." "You get the East Wing," Leopold replied smoothly. "And the day I try to manage you, I expect you to stab me with a letter opener." A genuine, unpracticed smile broke across Beatrice's face. She placed her free hand in his. "Then I accept your bargain, Leopold." He exhaled a rough, heavy breath, leaning down until his forehead briefly rested against hers, right there in front of her stunned siblings. "Thank God. Now let us leave this wretched city. I want to show you the dogs." 3 weeks later, London society received its final shock. There was no grand spectacle at St. George's. The Duke of Ashbourne married Beatrice Hastings in a tiny, draughty stone church in Derbyshire. The only witnesses were a weeping Louisa, a thoroughly defeated Richard, and the Dowager Duchess. Agatha stood in the front pew, leaning heavily on her wooden cane. She wore the frayed grey wool coat, and as her son kissed his new, stubbornly cynical Duchess, Agatha smiled. "Thank you for experiencing the complete story of Beatrice and Leopold. If you loved seeing a cynical, sharp-tongued heroine bypass the toxic rules of high society to find an equally grounded, powerful partner, please smash that like button. It helps this channel grow and tells the algorithm to bring you more grounded historical romance dramas. Don't forget to share this video with fellow romance fans who who appreciate a story where actions speak louder than empty words. Subscribe and ring the bell for more original storytelling. What was your favorite moment? Tell me in the comments below.